The radar screen went white for 4 seconds. Not static, not a glitch. White, clean, total, like something had reached out and covered the scope with a hand. Then it cleared, and there was nothing there at all. No ice, no contact, no coastline 40 miles off our port beam. Just empty ocean where a return had been sitting for the last 6 hours. I keyed the intercom. Bridge, combat. We just lost the shoreline paint. Nobody answered right away, and in the silence I heard something over the open channel that I still can't explain. A long, low groan, like metal folding, except we were the only ship for 80 miles in any direction. Those who served know that war leaves more than scars. Leaves unanswered questions, files that disappear, memories no one believes. Here, the veterans speak, and for the first time, they're the ones telling it. Welcome to War Veterans Stories. This is Case File 06. I'm Petty Officer First Class Dorian Voss, and for 11 months, I served aboard the United States Coast Guard cutter Kittiwake, standing radar and sonar watch on Ocean Station November out in the Bering Sea, where the charts still had blank spaces on them in 1978. What happened aboard that ship in the first week of February, I've never been able to put into a report that anyone believed. I've told it to 3 different chiefs, 1 flight surgeon, and my own wife, and every one of them gave me the same look. The look you give a man who spent too many hours alone with a headset on, listening to an ocean that isn't supposed to talk back. I'm not asking you to believe it either. I'm just telling you what the instruments recorded, what 4 other people besides me saw with their own eyes, and what we never found an explanation for, no matter how many times the Coast Guard tried to hand us one. The Kittiwake was a 254-foot weather cutter, an old lady even by 1978 standards, built for one job: sit on a fixed point of ocean called Station November, roughly 600 miles southwest of Kodiak, and take the pulse of the North Pacific, barometric pressure, sea temperature, wind shear. Twice a day we sent a weather balloon up into weather nobody sane would fly through, and twice a day some meteorologist in Anchorage used our numbers to keep airliners from flying into typhoons they couldn't see coming. It was miserable duty. 30 days on station, rolling in 40-foot swells, no liberty, no mail that didn't come by helicopter drop, and a winter darkness that swallowed the sun by 3 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Commander Holt Ambrose had the con, 44 years old, prematurely gray, the kind of officer who'd read every regulation twice and quoted the second reading. He'd come up through weather cutters his whole career, and he loved the Bering Sea the way some men love a difficult woman, helplessly and with a permanent bruise to show for it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. When Ambrose walked onto the bridge, the whole watch straightened without being told. Chief Boatswain's mate Reuben Castellan ran deck division, and more importantly, ran the ship. 22 years in, built like something poured rather than born, hands scarred from wire rope and frostbite both. Castellan had survived 2 typhoons in the South China Sea during the war and claimed the Bering Sea in February was worse than either of them. I believed him. He didn't believe in much of anything he couldn't put a wrench on, which is part of why what happened to him mattered so much. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Priya Sundaram was our entire medical department. 1 corpsman for a crew of 95, 400 miles from the nearest real hospital. She'd trained as an ER tech before she enlisted, and she had the calm of someone who had already seen the worst a human body could do to itself. She kept a logbook of everything, every injury, every odd complaint, in handwriting so neat it looked typed. That logbook became important later, because it was the only official document on the entire ship nobody could later explain away. And there was Seaman Wexford Cray, 20 years old, from a landlocked town in Nebraska, who had never seen the ocean before boot camp and had somehow ended up on the loneliest patch of it in the world. Cray stood lookout with me more nights than anyone else on the ship, mostly because nobody else wanted the midwatch in February, and mostly because he was the one who saw it first. We'd been on station 9 days when the weather turned strange. Not stormy, strange. The barometer held rock steady, which almost never happens out there, and the sea went flat and oily under a sky the color of a healing bruise. Sundaram noted in her log that 4 separate crewmen reported the same headache within an hour of each other, a pressure behind the eyes that aspirin didn't touch. Nobody thought much of it. You get used to your body doing strange things on a ship in the middle of nowhere. On the 6th of February, at 23:40 hours, I had the radar watch in combat with Cray standing communications beside me. The scope was clean, empty water in every direction. Exactly what you'd expect, 400 miles from anywhere. Then, at the very edge of our 50-mile range ring, a return appeared. Not a ship, not weather clutter. A single, tight, stationary paint that sat there like it had always been there. Like the equipment had simply decided to start telling the truth about something invisible until that moment. Sonar, combat. You got anything on the passive board bearing 295? I called down to the sound room. Petty Officer 2nd Class Emery Falk ran passive sonar that watch, an old fisherman's son from Massachusetts who could tell a humpback from a fin whale by the shape of the line on the paper without even thinking about it. His voice came back tight. Yeah, Voss, I got something. It's not on the chart of anything I know. It's low, real low, and it's... He stopped. It's what, Falk? It's not moving like an animal moves. I want to be precise about what that means, because on a ship like ours, you learn animal signatures the way a farmer learns cattle. Whales have a rhythm to their track. They surface, they dive. Their speed changes with breath and current. What Falk had on his paper moved in a straight line, dead steady. No rhythm at all, like something being towed, except we were the only vessel out there, and there was nothing to tow it. Ambrose came down to combat himself a few minutes after midnight. He looked at the scope, looked at Falk's plot, and asked the question every good commanding officer asks first. Could this be equipment failure? We've cross-checked twice, sir, I told him. 2 independent systems, same bearing, same range, same track. He was quiet for a moment. Then log it and keep tracking it. If it's a foreign trawler running dark, I want to know before it's inside our safety zone. That was the last calm sentence anybody spoke on the Kittiwake for the next 36 hours. Over the following 2 hours, the contact closed the range. Slowly at first, a few hundred yards every 10 minutes, the kind of drift that could be explained by current. Then the drift became a track, and the track became unmistakable. Whatever it was moving toward us on its own power, against the current, in water that never got shallower than 1,100 fathoms. At Yoda 140, Cray was up on the port bridge wing doing a visual sweep with the big searchlight when he called down over the sound-powered phone, and his voice had already changed. Thinner, faster, a kid's voice again instead of a sailor's. Combat, bridge lookout. I've got a light in the water, bearing about 280, maybe 800 yards. Sir, it's under the surface, and it's coming up. I left Falk on the sound gear and went up to the bridge wing myself, mostly because I didn't believe him, and partly because a 19-year-old on his first winter patrol will sometimes see whatever the dark wants him to see. I stood next to Cray with my own binoculars and found the light in about 4 seconds, because it wasn't subtle. It was a pale, blue-green glow, roughly the size of a basketball court, sitting maybe 30 feet under a perfectly black sea, and it did not flicker the way bioluminescence flickers. It held steady, the way a lit window holds steady from across a field. That's not plankton, Cray said, like he needed someone else to say it first. No, I agreed. It's not. Ambrose was on the bridge inside of 90 seconds, binoculars up before his coat was even zipped. He watched it for a long time without saying anything. And I remember thinking that was the moment the whole tone of the ship changed. Not because of what we were looking at, but because of how long our captain, a man who quoted regulations for fun, stood there with nothing to say about it at all. "Helm, come right 10 degrees, he said finally. "Let's open the range and see if it follows." The kittiwake came around, engines answering, wake curling white against the black water, and the light came with us. Not fast, not aggressive. It simply adjusted, the way a compass needle adjusts, until it was sitting on the same relative bearing it had held before the turn. "It's not fish, and it's not a boat," Castellan said. He'd come up from below in a foul weather jacket thrown over long underwear, hair still flattened from sleep. And he said it the way a man says something he wishes wasn't true. "Boats don't hold station like that in a beam sea, and nothing that swims holds a light like a lantern." At 02 ton, the light went out. Not faded, extinguished all at once, the way a switch works. Falk's contact on the sound gear held for another 11 minutes, and then it, too, disappeared. Not by moving out of range, but by simply stopping, the way a held breath stops. We didn't relax. Nobody on that bridge relaxed. We stood there in the cold, staring at the dark water, waiting for something to come back, and for 40 minutes, nothing did. Then the barometer dropped 9 millibars in 6 minutes, which our own weather technician, Petty Officer 2nd Class Iris Halloway, said afterward she had never seen happen without a storm attached to it, and there was no storm. The sea stayed flat as a table. The wind didn't rise. Only the number on the gauge told you that something enormous had changed in the air around us, and it had changed in a way none of the instruments were built to explain. At Uro 322, the general announcing system clicked on with no one at the microphone. Every speaker aboard the kittiwake, fore and aft, engine room to bridge, carried 3 seconds of open static, and then a single tone. Low, almost below what a human ear should register. More felt in the chest than heard. Then it cut off, and the one MC went dead silent. No hum, no carrier signal. Nothing, for the first time in anyone's memory aboard that ship. Sundaram wrote in her log, in that same careful handwriting. 324. Crew reports simultaneous nosebleeds. 3 cases, no other symptoms. Resolved within minutes. She underlined the word simultaneous twice. By ZO 400, Ambrose had the whole ship at what he called, in his log, modified general quarters. No weapons, because a weather cutter doesn't carry anything heavier than a couple of 50 caliber mounts we hadn't touched since a gunnery exercise the previous summer. But every watertight door dogged, every off-duty man roused and accounted for, and 2 lookouts posted on every wing instead of 1. He wanted eyes everywhere. He got them. It didn't help. At OR 51, Cray went missing from the port bridge wing. I want to be exact about the timeline because I've gone over it in my head more times than I can count. At 0449, I heard him on the sound-powered phone, reporting the sea state, routine, bored, the voice of a kid 2 hours from being relieved. At 0451, when Ambrose asked the bridge to confirm lookout positions during a routine check, nobody answered on the port circuit. A messenger went out to check. Cray wasn't there. His binoculars were sitting on the rail, lens caps still on, like he'd set them down mid-sentence. His foul weather jacket was still there too, buttoned, as though he'd stepped out of it rather than taken it off. For the next 11 minutes, the kittiwake was as close to chaos as I ever saw a Coast Guard cutter get. Castellan had every off-watch man mustered on the fantail with flashlights inside of 90 seconds. That's the kind of chief he was. Search parties went through every compartment twice. Sundaram stood by with a stretcher and a bag she'd already packed for hypothermia, because in that water, in February, a man doesn't have long. He wasn't in the water. He wasn't on the ship. Not for those 11 minutes. Not anywhere flashlights and hands and voices could reach. At 05:02, Falk called up from the sound room, and his voice had a crack in it I'd never heard from him before. "Combat, I've got him. I've got Cray on the sound-powered circuit, sir. He's talking, but he's not making sense." I grabbed a spare headset and heard it myself. Cray's voice, thin and slow, like a record played at the wrong speed, saying the same 6 or 7 words on a loop, not screaming, not panicked, almost peaceful. "It's so quiet down here. It's so quiet down here." Over and over, except Cray was a lookout with a sound-powered phone that only worked plugged into a jack on the bridge wing, and the bridge wing jack was empty. Nobody could explain what circuit his voice was riding. 2 minutes later, the transmission stopped, and 30 seconds after that, Castellan found him. Cray was sitting on the deck of the number 2 lifeboat, tucked under its canvas cover, a boat that hadn't been opened all patrol, dry, uninjured, and completely unaware that any time had passed. He thought it was still 23:40. He thought his watch had just started. When Castellan told him it was almost 5 in the morning, he laughed. The short, disbelieving laugh of a man being told a joke he doesn't understand. And then he looked at his own hands and stopped laughing, because his fingernails, all 10 of them, had gone a pale, waxy blue, like a man who'd been standing in ice water for hours, though every inch of him was bone dry. Sundaram got him below and wrapped him in blankets, and his court temperature, when she finally got a reading, was 94 degrees. Cold, dangerous, but nowhere near what should follow 11 minutes lost in February air, let alone what his fingernails suggested. His pulse was slow and steady. He wasn't in shock the way a frightened man is in shock. He was calm, disoriented, and every time Sundaram asked him what happened, he gave the same answer. "I don't know. I heard something call my name, and then Chief was shaking me and it was morning." He never remembered anything past that single sound. His name, spoken, he said, underneath everything, like it came up through the deck instead of across the air. He couldn't describe a voice, a face, a shape, just the sound of his own name, and then a gap in his life 11 minutes wide that he never got back. Ambrose logged it as a possible cold exposure fugue state, complicated by disorientation. He wrote that in the official report because it was the only sentence in the English language the Coast Guard was equipped to accept. He never once said it to me privately, standing on that bridge at dawn, drinking coffee neither of us wanted. What he said was, "I don't have a box for what just happened, Voss. I've got 30 years on cutters, and I don't have a box for it." We expected the contact to come back that night. It didn't. It waited 2 full days, long enough for the crew to talk themselves halfway into believing the whole thing had been some freak of weather and nerves, long enough for Cray to go back on light duty, pale but steady, refusing to talk about it beyond the same 6 sentences he'd already given Sundaram 3 times. On the 9th of February, at 2015 hours, it came back, and this time, it didn't stay at range. I had the watch again. By then, Ambrose had put me on every mid-watch he could justify, because I was the one who'd tracked it first, and he wanted continuity in combat more than he wanted me rested. Falk had the sound gear. At 2017, he called up a contact bearing 185, and this time there was no slow drift, no gradual approach. It appeared at 4,000 yards, and it was already closing at a speed that made no sense for anything without an engine. 20 knots, then 25, headed straight for our beam. "Bridge, combat, contact inbound, closing fast, recommend coming to flank speed," I called, and Ambrose didn't hesitate. The Kittiwake's old turbines answered as fast as 30-year-old machinery could answer, and we came around hard, putting the contact on our stern instead of our beam, opening what distance we could. It matched us. Whatever was tracking through that black water matched our new course and our new speed inside of 90 seconds, the way a shadow matches a man who starts running. Castellan was on deck that night, doing a line check with 2 seamen when he saw it break the surface off the port quarter. Not fully, not the way a whale broaches, but enough. He described it to me only once, weeks later, over coffee and Kodiak, in a voice that had none of his usual gravel in it. It wasn't a fish, Voss, and it wasn't a submarine, and it wasn't anything else I've got a word for. It was long, longer than the ship, maybe, and it didn't have an edge to it the way solid things have an edge, like looking at something through water that isn't there. And where it broke the surface, the water didn't splash. It just opened and then closed again, quiet as a hand going into a pocket. He said the temperature on deck dropped so fast, his own breath crystallized mid-word, and every light on that section of hull, running lights, deck floods, everything, dimmed to a third of their normal output for the 11 seconds the thing was visible, then snapped back the instant it submerged, with no electrical fault ever found afterward, no blown breaker, no logged voltage drop anywhere on the ship's systems except in the eyes of 3 men who watched it happen. Ambrose made the call that likely saved us. Instead of running, instead of maneuvering defensively the way a warship might, he ordered every deck light on the ship lit at full power, every searchlight aimed at the water around our hull, and the general alarm sounded continuously, not because he had a plan, but because he had a hunch, born of 30 years reading a sea that didn't like being watched. Whatever it wants, he told me later, it doesn't want to be seen doing it, so we make sure it's seen. For 6 minutes, the kittiwake sat lit up like a carnival in the middle of the Bering Sea, alarms screaming, every hand on deck with a light in their fist, and the contact circled us at 1,000 yards, then 800, then 500. Close enough that Falk said the return on his gear filled the entire top half of his display. Close enough that 4 separate men reported hearing, faintly, under the alarm and the wind, that same low tone the one MC had carried 2 nights before, except now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the water, from the hull plating under their boots, from inside their own skulls. Then, at 20:29, it turned away. Not fled, turned, unhurried, the way something turns when it has simply finished deciding something. The contact opened range steadily for the next 10 minutes, and then, the same way it had the first night, it simply stopped registering, not by leaving our sensor range, but by ceasing to exist on our instruments at all. Mid-track, no trailing signature, no decay in signal strength. One sweep it was there, the next sweep it wasn't. We never saw it again. We finished the remaining 19 days of Station November duty in a kind of hush I've never experienced on a ship before or since. Nobody joked on watch anymore. Nobody complained about the cold the way sailors complain about the cold, as sport, as ritual. The weather balloon still went up twice a day. The numbers still went to Anchorage. The kittiwake did its job, because that's what a Coast Guard cutter does, regardless of what swims under it. But every man aboard that ship had quietly recalculated what the ocean was capable of, and none of us said so out loud, because saying it out loud made it a fact instead of a feeling, and facts have to go in reports. Sundaram kept documenting nosebleeds, headaches, 2 more reports of vivid, identical dreams from men in different berthing compartments who'd never spoken to each other about it before comparing notes. Dreams of standing on ice that wasn't there, looking down through water that glowed the same pale blue-green cray and I had seen from the bridge wing. She wrote it all down in that neat, careful hand, dated and timed, because she said a corpsman's job is to keep the record straight, even when nobody upstream wants to read it. Cray never fully came back to who he'd been before that night in the lifeboat. He did his job. He stood his watches. but he flinched at loud silences the way other men flinch at loud noises. And more than once, I caught him standing at the rail in daylight, just looking down at the water, like he was waiting for something to answer a question he'd never quite finished asking. He told me once, near the end of the patrol, that some nights he still heard his name, faint, from somewhere below the waterline, and that the strangest part wasn't the fear of it. It was that some small, quiet part of him wanted to answer. We made port in Kodiak on the 4th of March. Ambrose submitted his patrol report through channels the way every commanding officer does, and within it, in language stripped of every word that might have gotten the report kicked back or the ship's crew referred to psychiatric evaluation, he described an unidentified subsurface contact of unknown origin, tracked intermittently by radar and sonar over a 72-hour period, accompanied by unexplained personnel and equipment anomalies. He attached Sundaram's medical log. He attached Falk's sonar tapes and my radar plots. He requested a follow-up investigation. Before any memo came back, though, a 2-man team flew up from district headquarters in Juneau, arriving on the pier in Kodiak 9 days after we docked, both of them in civilian clothes despite carrying government identification, both of them careful never to use the word investigation out loud, even once in 3 days of doing exactly that. They set up in the base's small conference room with a reel-to-reel recorder and a stack of yellow legal pads, and they interviewed the crew one at a time, starting with Ambrose, working down through the watch officers, then Castellan, then Falk, then me, then Sundaram, then, last of all, and longest of all, Cray, the senior of the two, a soft-spoken man who never gave a rank, only a last name, Prentice, sat across from me for almost 2 hours. He was polite in the specific, patient way of someone who has heard a great many strange stories and has trained himself not to let his face show which ones he believes. "Walk me through the first contact again," he said, "in your own words. Don't worry about matching what you told the district office in your written statement. I want what you actually remember, not what you've had 6 weeks to organize into a report," I told him. The white radar screen, the tone under the alarm, the light in the water that didn't flicker like plankton flickers. He wrote very little of it down, which unsettled me more than if he'd written everything, because it told me he already had the broad shape of the story from 4 other men, and was only listening now for the places where our accounts diverged. "They don't diverge," I said, when I noticed him not writing. "That's what you're checking for, isn't it? Whether 5 different sailors independently invented the same story. They don't diverge, sir, because none of us invented anything." He allowed himself something close to a smile. "No, Petty Officer Voss, they don't diverge. That's actually the part of my job I find hardest to explain to the people I answer to. 5 trained observers, standing different watches in different compartments of the ship, describing the same tone, the same light, the same timeline, down to the minute in some cases, with no opportunity to coordinate a story beforehand. If this were a hoax, it would be the most disciplined hoax I've encountered in 11 years of doing this. It isn't a hoax. I know that much for certain. What I don't have is a category to put it in that anyone above me is willing to accept. So what happens to it? It gets filed, he said, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he said it. It gets a case number, a classification that keeps it out of general circulation, and a cover memorandum written in language dry enough that nobody who reads it feels obligated to ask a second question. That's not a conspiracy, Petty Officer. It's an institution protecting its own comfort. The Coast Guard doesn't have a box for what happened to your ship. So instead of building a new box, it builds 4 small, boring boxes and puts one piece of the story in each of them, and hopes nobody notices that the 4 boxes don't add up to the whole event. He asked me one more question before he switched off the recorder, and it's the question I've turned over in my head more than any other in the years since. If you had to guess, Not report. Not testify. Just guess. What do you think it was? I thought about the light, patient and steady under black water. I thought about Cray's 11 minutes and the calm in his voice describing them. I thought about Castellan's description of water that opened instead of splashing. I think it was curious, I told him. I think it came to look at us the way we'd go. Look at something in a tide pool, careful not to disturb it too much. And I think it left once it had seen whatever it came to see. I don't think it meant us any harm. I just don't think harm was ever the question it was asking. Prentice nodded slowly, clicked off the recorder, and thanked me for my time. And neither of us ever spoke about it again after that room in Kodiak. Though 6 months later, a Christmas card arrived at my parents' house with no return address and no signature, just a single line written inside. Still no box for it. P. I've kept that card in a drawer for 46 years. It's the closest thing to an official confirmation any of us ever received. What came back 6 weeks later was a single-page memorandum attributing the sonar and radar contacts to anomalous propagation caused by a temperature inversion layer, the light in the water to bioluminescent plankton bloom, species unconfirmed, Cray's missing 11 minutes to acute cold stress disorientation, self-resolving, and the simultaneous nosebleeds and headaches to barometric pressure fluctuation consistent with the observed weather event. Every single anomaly given its own tidy, separate, scientific-sounding label, none of them explaining why 5 different phenomena across 3 different ship systems and a dozen human bodies had all occurred within the same 72-hour window, and never once before or since in the recorded history of that patrol area. Ambrose read the memo standing on the pier in Kodiak, in front of me and Castellan both, and he didn't argue with it, because arguing with it wouldn't have changed a word of it. He just folded it once, put it in his jacket pocket, and said, quietly, the only thing I ever heard him say about the whole incident that sounded like his real opinion instead of his official one. They've got an answer for every piece of it. They just don't have an answer for all of it. All at once, the way it actually happened. Nobody upstairs wants to write the report that says the truth, which is that something out there took a good, hard look at this ship for 3 days, decided something about us, and then left. We'll never know what it decided. That's the part that keeps me up nights. Not what it was, what it decided. I finished my enlistment 8 months later and left the Coast Guard in the fall of 1978, not because of what happened on Station November, or that's what I told myself at the time, though I've come to doubt it since. I went home to Oregon, took a job running harbor tugs, work that kept me close enough to salt water to feel normal, but far enough from open ocean that I told myself I wasn't running from anything. I was wrong about that too, probably. But a man gets to keep a few small lies if they help him sleep. I stayed in touch with a handful of the Kittiwake crew over the years, the way sailors do. A Christmas card, a phone call when somebody's father died, a chance meeting at a reunion nobody quite planned to attend. Falk left the sound room life behind entirely, went to work for a commercial fishing outfit out of New Bedford, and told me once, half joking, that he'd never again in his life put on a set of sonar headphones without a small, cold flicker of dread that something on the other end might answer back. He was joking. I don't think he was lying. Sundaram made a full career out of the service, 22 years, retired as a senior chief. I asked her once, years later, whether she still had that logbook. She said the original had gone into Ambrose's official report and vanished into whatever filing system swallows things the Coast Guard doesn't want examined too closely. But she'd kept her own private notes, copied out by hand before she turned the book over, because some instinct told her the record needed to survive somewhere. The Navy, the Coast Guard, didn't control. She still has them. She showed me a photocopy once. The handwriting hadn't changed at all. Neither had the certainty in it. Castellan retired a master chief, bought a small piece of land inland, as far from tidewater as a man who'd spent 30 years on ships could get without moving to Kansas outright. When I visited him the last time, not long before he passed, he was sitting on his porch, looking at a mountain instead of an ocean. And I asked him, because I'd always wanted to, and never had the nerve, whether he thought about that night on the Kittiwake much. "Every time it's quiet," he said. "Real quiet. Because that's what it felt like right before. Not loud, not violent, just quiet. The way a held breath is quiet. Right before something decides whether to let it out." Cray I lost track of for almost 20 years, and then found again by accident at a Coast Guard reunion in Seattle in the late 90s. A grown man in his 40s with kids of his own, running a hardware store somewhere in the Midwest, about as far from the Bering Sea as a man from Nebraska could arrange to be twice in one lifetime. We got a drink together and talked for 3 hours, and near the end of the night, when the bar had mostly cleared out, he told me something he said he'd never told anyone else. Not his wife, not a single Coast Guard psychiatrist in the 2 evaluations they'd put him through after the patrol. He said that, in the 11 minutes nobody could account for, he did remember something. Just one thing. One image. That he'd never reported because he knew exactly how it would sound. He remembered standing. Not sitting, not lying down, standing. Somewhere cold and dark and utterly silent. And looking down, and seeing his own ship, the Kittiwake, small and lit up and very far below him, the way you'd see a toy boat from the top of a tall building, except there was no building, no railing, no ground under his feet at all, and he remembered the calm of it, the total absence of fear in a moment that should have been the most frightening of his life, and how that absence of fear had scared him more in the years since than any nightmare ever could. "I think something was showing me the ship," he told me. "I don't know why. I don't know what it wanted me to see. But for 11 minutes, Voss, I wasn't afraid of anything. And I've spent every year since trying to get that feeling back. And I never have. Not once. Not for a second. And some nights I think that's the part I actually miss." Ambrose died in 2003, and I went to the funeral in Alameda, and I stood at the back of the chapel next to Castellan, both of us in suits that didn't fit as well as our old uniforms had. And somebody from the family read out a list of his commands, his commendations. 30 years of a career spent almost entirely on ships most people have never heard of. Doing weather work nobody outside the service understands the value of. Nobody in that chapel mentioned Station November. Nobody mentioned 3 days in February of 1978. It wasn't in any obituary, wasn't in any citation, wasn't part of the official story of who Holt Ambrose was. And yet Castellan leaned over to me during the reception afterward and said the truest thing anybody said that whole day. He carried that patrol the rest of his life. You could see it on him if you knew what you were looking at. A man who'd stood on a bridge and watched the ocean look back at him and never once got the satisfaction of an answer. As for me, I never got a clean answer either, and by now I've stopped expecting one. I've read everything I could find on temperature inversions and anomalous propagation and bioluminescent blooms, because that's the training talking. You don't stop being a technician just because you left the service. You just point the instrument at your own memory instead of a scope. And every explanation I've ever found accounts for one piece of what happened on that patrol, and none of them account for all of it happening together. In that order, on that ship, to those people, in that narrow window of 72 hours, in the coldest, emptiest stretch of ocean in the northern hemisphere. I've made my peace with that. Some nights, it's an easier peace than others. The Kittiwake herself was decommissioned in 1984, sold for scrap not long after, cut apart in a yard somewhere on the west coast, the way old ships always are, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but a name in a registry and a handful of men who remember what it felt like to stand on her deck. I went to see her once, near the end, before the cutting started, just to walk her decks one more time. I stood on the port bridge wing where Cray had been standing that night, where his binoculars sat with the lens cap still on, and I looked down at the pier water, gray and ordinary and entirely unremarkable, and I felt nothing except the cold, which felt, honestly, like a mercy. I think about the light most of all, more than the sound, more than Cray's 11 minutes, more than the way the deck lights dimmed on Castellan's watch, that pale blue-green glow 30 feet down, holding perfectly steady under a black winter sea, the size of a small building, not flickering, not moving, just there, patient, the way a lit window is patient when somebody's waiting up for you to come home. I've spent 40 years wondering what would have happened if we'd gone toward it instead of away from it. If Ambrose had ordered us to close the range that first night instead of opening it, whether we'd have found an answer down there or simply never come back up to ask the question again. I don't know. I'll never know. None of us will. What I do know is this. The Bering Sea in February is one of the last true wildernesses left on this planet, a place where the charts still admit, in their own quiet cartographer's way, that they don't know everything that's down there. We map the surface. We track the currents. We send our instruments down as far as the pressure will let them go, and we call the numbers that come back data, as though a number were the same thing as understanding. It isn't. It never has been. Somewhere under that black water, in February of 1978, something took 3 days to look closely at 95 American sailors, going about the most ordinary, unglamorous job the sea has to offer, measuring wind and pressure and temperature, so that other people, warm and dry and thousands of miles away, could fly safely through weather they'd never see coming. And then it left, without ever telling us why it had come, or what it found, or whether it was satisfied. The Coast Guard's official position remains what it was in 1978. Temperature inversion, bioluminescent bloom, cold stress disorientation, barometric anomaly. 4 tidy answers for one event that never once, in the memory of anyone who lived through it, felt like 4 separate things happening by coincidence. It felt like one thing, watching, deciding, and then choosing to go. And I have never once in 46 years found a form of paper that lets a man write that sentence down and have it taken seriously. So I tell it instead, the way sailors have always told the stories the reports won't hold, out loud, over a drink, to whoever will sit still long enough to listen without reaching for an explanation before I've even finished the sentence. I tell it because Sundaram kept her notes, and because Castellan kept the memory of a quiet he could never fully describe, and because Cray, God keep him, still sometimes misses the 11 strangest, calmest minutes of his entire life. I tell it because Ambrose carried it to his grave without ever once being allowed to say what he actually believed, and somebody ought to say it for him now that he can't. We were not attacked. Nothing tried to sink us. Nothing tried to eat us. Nothing tried, as far as any of us could ever tell, to do us any harm at all. We were observed, closely, patiently, over 3 days and 3 encounters, by something that read our lights, and our alarms, and our fear the way we read its sonar signature, and its glowing water, and its impossible speed, as data, as behavior, as a pattern, worth 3 days of careful, silent attention before it finally, deliberately, chose to withdraw. I don't know what it was. Nobody who was there that week knows what it was. Not really. Not in any way that would satisfy an investigator, or a scientist, or a skeptic looking for the cleanest, simplest explanation available. What I know is what the instruments recorded, what 5 different human beings independently reported seeing and hearing and feeling, and what an entire crew of 95 sailors carried home with them from a patrol nobody back on land will ever be able to picture correctly, because the version they'll picture always has an explanation in it, and the version we lived never did. The ocean out past Station November is still out there, 600 miles southwest of Kodiak, cold and dark and 11,000 feet deep, doing exactly what it was doing before we ever sailed into it, and exactly what it'll keep doing, long after every one of us who was aboard the Kittiwake that February is gone. Somewhere down in that darkness, whatever looked back at us that week is either still there or long gone, or was never really a single thing at all, in the way a storm isn't really a single thing, but a pattern the ocean makes out of pressure and cold and the accident of circumstance. I used to need to know which. I don't anymore. I've settled instead for what I actually have, which is the plot line on an old radar scope, a corpsman's careful handwriting, a chief's description of water that opened instead of splashing, and a young man's memory of being, for 11 impossible minutes, completely and inexplicably unafraid. That's the whole of it. That's everything I have. I was there. I stood the watch. I read the scope. I heard the tone come up through a dead intercom at 3:30 in the morning, and I have never, in 46 years since, found a single explanation that accounts for all of it at once, the way it actually happened, out there, on the edge of the charts, where the ocean still keeps whatever it wants to keep, and tells us only exactly as much as it ever decides we're allowed to know. Thank you for listening to this case file. Stories like this one only survive because the men and women who lived them are finally willing to speak, and because people like you are willing to listen without looking away. If this account stayed with you, subscribe to War Veteran Stories so the next file doesn't stay buried either. For the first time, they're the ones telling it. Case File 06 is closed. Case File 07 is already waiting to be opened.